Good afternoon, everybody. Today, let us talk about Carl Gustav Jung's psychology and literature. We know that Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology. He was not only influential in psychology, but he influenced even psychiatry, anthropology, philosophy, religious studies, and related fields. He worked as a research scientist at the famous Borgolzil Hospital under Eugenie Bleuler. He explained the ideas of introvert and extrovert personalities, archetypes, and the power of unconscious. He collaborated with Sigmund Freud, but he disagreed with him about the sexual basis of neurosis. His essay, Psychology and Literature, that was published in 1930. Just note down the date or year. Psychology and Literature, published in 1930. It is a critique of classical Freudian psychoanalytical approach to literary studies. In this essay, Jung discusses the social role of a creative writer from a psychological and psychoanalytical perspective. He talks about the similarities, or he talks about the creative process, like T.S. Eliot, who talked about the process of creative writing in his famous essay, Tradition and Individual Talent. So, Jung has written a lot, and if you want me to name few works, they are psychological types. It was published in 1921. Psychology of the Unconscious, 1912. Modern Man in Search of His Soul, 1933. The Undiscovered Self, 1957. The Psychiatric Studies, the collected works of C.G. Jung, 1953. Studies in Word Association, 1907. The Psychology of Dementia Praxicos, 1930. The Psychogenesis of Mental Disease, 1991. Two essays on analytical psychology, 1917. The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. This is a long list of the works that have been written by Carl Jung. Now let us talk about his essay, Psychology and Literature. His concept of psychology is little bit closer with literature than Freudian psychology. His essay or his theory is a fusion of psychology, anthropology, and literature. According to him, psychology is the study of the psychic process. Human psyche is home to of all sciences and art. Psychological research tries to explain the formation of a work of art, which can be described as creative process, and looks at the factors which make a person an artist, that is, a writer. The psychological critique analyzes differently a work of art from that of a literary critic. Literary critic also analyzes the text, and psychological critic also analyzes the text. But there is difference between claim that they have different perspective. Novels are more fruitful for psychologists, in which the author has not already given a psychological interpretation of his characters, and which therefore leave enough room for analysis and explanation. Means those novels only which do not give everything in detail about this behavior or psychological behavior of the character, or the psychology behind the behavior of a character. So the critic is free for analysis and explanation. So the novels written by French novelist Pierre Benoit, English novels of Rider Haggard, and Conan Doyle's detective fiction, and American novels of Melville, that is, the example can be given as Moby Dick, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, are great novels. For the psychologist, the most interesting thing to find out are the hidden psychological assumptions. Such novels are not as great as the novels where hidden psychological assumptions pose a challenge to the psychologist. Here, Jung talks about the two types of creative creation. The first one is psychological and the second one visionary. Let us talk about the psychological at first. Everything is explained so clearly that the psychologist has very little task to perform. Means everything is stated clearly by the writer. But in contrast to this, in visionary literature, the work is endowed with deeper meaning, and the psychologist has to take a lot of attempts to reach to the meaning. Means he has to read and reread the same work again and again every time the critic finds a new meaning. So he has to take a lot of efforts to reach to the correct meaning of the text. Let me now make it clear the difference between psychological mode and visionary mode. Let me share the slide with you. Here it is. So, the psychological mode. In this mode, the material are taken from ordinary human consciousness, whereas the experiences that are related or that are depicted in visionary mode are related with man's unconscious, the unfathomed mind. The poet transforms the material which is taken from ordinary human consciousness in psychological mode from ordinary to the poetic. Illumination of contents of consciousness. The poet leaves nothing to the psychologist to explain. Means everything is explained clearly. Self-explanatory. The work is self-explanatory and no obscurity remains. But in visionary mode, we find the experiences are related with man's unconscious or the unfathomed mind. We are astonished, taken aback, and we need commentaries and explanations. Cover figures may be an attempt to conceal the basic experience. Conceal the basic experience. We have to hide that experience so that the critic will be more and more confused. By relating it with monstrous, chaotic images of the world or humans completely unknown to ordinary men, the fantasy of the poet and is understood as a poetic license. It is not self-explanatory. There is obscurity, and due to this obscurity only, the critic has to go again and again to the same work. Certain poets encourage this view so as to keep a distance between them and their works. In visionary mode, or you may say the visionary mode is associated more with the mysterious, uncanny, and deceptive things. Human enlightenment is born out of fear. In daytime, man believes in an ordered cosmos. Everything happens in an ordered manner, ordered way. He tries to maintain faith against the fear of chaos that besits him by night. The seers, prophets, leaders, and enlighteners were also familiar with the nocturnal world. Man has known it from the time immemorial. We want an ordered world which is safe and manageable. But in our midst, the poet now and then catches the sight of the figures of night world. He sees something of the psychic world that strikes terror into the savage and the barbarian. In the primitive culture, too, there were attempts to give expression to the visionary mode. After that, Jung talks about collective unconsciousness. Collective unconscious is a certain psychic disposition which is shaped by the forces of heredity. That is, heredity of a person, heredity of mankind, because it's a collective unconscious. It is in the mind of everyone. For example, the fear of the ghost. In the physical structure of the body, we find traces of earlier stages of evolution. It is a fact that in eclipses of consciousness, in dreams, narcotic states, and the cases of insanity, there came to the surface psychic products or contents that show all the traits of primitive levels of psychic development. Literature is manifestation of collective unconscious. They bring abnormal and dangerous level of unconscious into equilibrium in a purposive way. Creative person is a duality of contradictory attitudes. A human being with personal life, and the second one, an impersonal creative person. Means any creative writer, you can divide the writers into two categories. One thing is that a human being with personal life means his work will reflect his own personal life. And the second category is that the impersonal writers, that is a creative person, means though the things have not happened in the life of a writer, he creates the events with the help of his imagination and the work is created. So personal life is there, one category, and impersonal or creative writer is the another category. So we know very well that any artist is a man of higher sense. He is a collective man who carries and shapes the unconscious psychic life of mankind. The artist has to sacrifice his joy, satisfaction, and has to suffer because of the divine gift of creative fire in him. Whenever the creative force predominates, Whenever creative force predominates, human life is ruled and molded by the unconscious as against the active will. It is the work that determines the poet's fate and the psychic development. The present essay is notable for its attempt to discuss the social role of a creative writer from a psychological and psychoanalytical perspective. It is similar to T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonal creative process. Let us talk about the difference between the literary critic and psychological critic. So, literary critic, or for the literary critic, from the perspective of literary critic, the most interesting work, as the most of the elements of fiction, like motives or thoughts of characters, are explained and are made explicit by the author. The writer himself makes everything clear. That is the literary critic. One more thing, the most uninteresting novels for a psychologist would be the works where these things are not explained and made explicit by the author. And there is a room for interpretation. Means everything is stated clearly. So there is no room for interpretation. And that's why psychological critics don't like the way in which the writer writes or gives you every details in a clear, or you may say explain it in detail. Contrast to this, any work any work which doesn't explain many things or details of the behaviors or motives of the character, they are disliked by literary critics. On the contrary, they are most liked by psychological critics. The most interesting novels for a psychologist would be the works where these things are not explained, means motives or thoughts of characters are not explained and made explicit by the author, that there is a room for interpretation. Psychological literature draws its material from conscious mind. Visionary literature draws its material from unconscious mind. Jung points out that the first part of Goethe's Faust is an example of psychological literature. Means the things are the things are, you may say, given in a clear way. They are explained in detail. While the second part is visionary in nature, where the writer gives enough space for the psychological critic to read and reread to come to the proper meaning of the text. According to Freud, while interpreting the text, the personality of the author counts much importance. But Jung thinks that the author's personality is not the most important aspect of a literary work, as a writer usually has to transcend the personal and the subjective in order to make his work appealing to others. Means the writer has to transcend the personal and the subjective so that to make his work appealing to others. Means he tries or he goes for impersonality. Freud thinks that creative writer or creative work of the author maybe or can be the reflection of author's neurosis. But at the same time, Freud fails to explain why all neurotics are not authors. Means every neurotic person is not the author. So he fails to prove that every neurotic person can have the vision to be a writer or a good writer. Jung points out that the contents and materials of visionary literature are not drawn from the author's psychosexual history, as Freudians would insist, but they are taken from the racial memory or the collective unconscious of the entire human race. Such symbols, figures, and images are primordial and not specific either to an individual or even to a culture. The collective unconscious is sometimes called the objective side. It refers to the idea that a segment of the deepest unconscious mind is genetically inherited and is not shaped by personal experience. Collective unconscious is common to all human beings and is responsible for a number of deep seated beliefs and instincts, such as spirituality, sexual behavior, and life and death instincts. Like Freud, Jung regarded the psyche is made up of a number of separate but interacting systems. The three main ones are the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. Freud had said id, ego, and superego. Okay, here ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. Ego represents the conscious mind as comprises the thought, memories, and emotions a person is aware of. Means he knows what are the memories in his mind, what are the thoughts going on in his mind. The ego is responsible for the feeling of identity and continuity. The conscious consists of two layers, that is personal conscious and collective conscious. Personal conscious contains temporarily forgotten information and repressed memories. The collective or the transpersonal unconscious comprises latent memories from our ancestral and evolutionary part. The human mind has innate characteristics imprinted on it as a result of evolution. These universal predispositions stem from our ancestral part. You reject the idea or the concept of tabula rasa, or the notion that human mind is a blank slate at birth to be written on solely by experience. Means there are many things in his mind that are inherited from his heredity. He believed that the human mind retains fundamental unconscious biological aspects of our ancestors. Fear of dark or of snakes and spiders might be examples. Jung called these ancestral memories and images archetypes. Archetypes are images and thoughts which have universal meaning across cultures, which may show up dreams, literature, art, and religion. Jung believes that these symbols from different cultures are often very similar as they are emerged from the archetypes shared by the whole human race, which are part of collective unconscious. Now let us talk about the archetypes. There are a large number of archetypes. Some examples of archetypes that Jung proposed include first, the mother, second, birth, third, death, fourth, rebirth, fifth, the anima, sixth, power, seventh, the hero, eighth, the child. Jung considered the mother archetype to be the most important. He thought the archetype not only manifested in the literal form, personal mother, grandmother, stepmother, mother in law, but also in the figurative form of mothers like Mother Mary, country, the earth, the woods, a garden, etc. Another example of is figure of cross in Christians and swastik in Hindus become a sacred symbol. Archetypes manifest themselves in mythology, religion, spirituality, and folklore, and they affect human behavior deeply. Some of the most important archetypes in Jungian psychoanalysis are the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the wise old man. Let us talk about persona. The personal represents all of the different social masks that we wear among various social groups and situations. Let me share a screen with you. Okay. The personal represents all of the different social masks that we wear among various social groups and situations. It is the outward face we present to the world. It conceals our real self, and Jung describes it as conformity archetype. The persona develops as a social mask to contain all the primitive urges, impulses, and emotions that are not considered socially acceptable. The persona archetype allows the people to adapt to the world around them and fit it with the society in which they live. This is the public face of the person. Mask. Sometimes a person seems very kind, but inwardly he is very dangerous. So the public face is different from the real self. This is the public face of the person, which can be different from the real face. When it drops, he has to encounter the dark repellent side. The next archetype is the shadow, which consists of the sex and life instincts. The shadow exists as a part of the unconscious mind. See, the shadow exists as a part of the unconscious mind and is composed of the repressed ideas in the mind, repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, instincts, and shortcomings. It contains all the things which are unacceptable not only to society but also to one's own personal morals and values. It might include things such as envy, greed, prejudice, hate, aggression, because we cannot express our greed in public. Even sometimes we feel that this is not good, but it is there in your mind. So, sex and life instincts form the part for the archetype, the shadow. This is often described as the darker side of the psyche, representing wildness, chaos, and the unknown. Jung suggested that the shadow can appear in dreams or visions and may take variety of forms. It might appear as a snake, a monster, a demon, a dragon, or some other dark, wild, or exotic figure. Jung believed this archetype is present in all of us. It is the source of both our creative and destructive energies. The next archetype, the anima or animus. It is the mirror image of our biological sex. That is the unconscious feminine side in male and masculine tendencies in women. The anima is a feminine image in the male side. Anima is a feminine image in the male psyche, and the animus represents the true self rather than the image we present to others and serve as the primary source of communication with the collective unconscious. Jung believed that psychological changes as well as social influences contributed to the development of sex roles and gender identities. In many cultures, men and women are encouraged to adopt traditional and often rigid gender roles. Jung suggested that this discouragement of men exploring their feminine aspects and women exploring their masculine aspects served to undermine psychological development. The combined anima and animus is known as the syzygy or the divine couple, that is Ardha Nari Nateshwar. Okay, Ardha Nari Nateshwar. The CZG represents completion, unification, and wholeness. The next archetype is the self. The self is an archetype which represents the unified unconsciousness and the consciousness of an individual. Creating the self occurs through a process known as individuation, in which the various aspects of personality are integrated. Jung often represented the self as a circle, square, or mandala. The self archetype represents the unified psyche as whole. Jung suggested that there were two different centers of personality. Two different centers of personality. The ego makes up the center of consciousness, but it is the self that lies at the center of personality. Personality encompasses not only consciousness but also ego and the unconscious mind. For Jung, the ultimate aim for an individual is to achieve a sense of cohesive self. The next archetype that Jung describes is the wise old man. Along with this, the wise old man is an archetype who represents profound philosopher distinguished for wisdom. Since Senex is another term used for the wise old man, Senex, wise man. In India, we have Guru who enlightens us to choose the right path. The function of creative artist, according to Jung, is to express the content of collective unconscious in a society, which is gradually losing its touch with this side of its personality due to process of modernization and secularization. A work of art would lead to man's reconnection with the collective unconscious, thus assisting him in the process of individuation. Shifting of the focus of psychoanalysis from personal psychosexual history to collective spiritual history in Jungian analytical theory made his theory extremely influential among the writers and critics. But Jung's theory fell out of favor with more materialistic oriented and relativist cultural theorists, along with scientific psychologists due to its universalizing and idealist notions and spiritual orientation. However, Jung's ideas have greatly influenced myths and archetypal theories of literature. In this way, psychology and literature is Carl Jung's Carl Jung's analysis of art, artist, and creative process. He justifies psychology for studying literature because all thoughts and expressions are derived from the human psyche. A great piece of art is like a dream. Great art is comprised of intentional acts, tapping into collective unconscious and pushing the newer to reflect and ponder on the great ultimate questions. He gives two types of artistic creations. This is we are summarizing in a brief: psychological and visionary artistic creation, and prefers visionary mode as it is endowed with deeper meaning. He defines the term collective unconscious, that is a certain psychic disposition shaped by the forces of heredity. He also explained the archetypes like persona, shadow, anima or animus, self, and the wise old man. Jung justifies psychology for studying literature. The present essay is notable for its attempt to discuss the social role of a creative writer from the psychological and psychoanalytical perspective. It is to some extent similar to T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonal creative process. So, here we are going to stop. Thank you.